My wife's parents demanded we live with them to save money, but had a secret plan to drain my finances. So we moved out and took legal action. I, 33M, married my wife, 29F, 5 years ago, and while I love her deeply, her parents have always been a problem. They're the kind of people who think they know better than everyone else and aren't shy about forcing their opinions on others. Early on, I noticed how they tried to control my wife. Little things like questioning her career choices, giving unsolicited advice about our relationship, and constantly guilt-tripping her into putting their needs first. I thought that after we got married, they'd back off. Instead, it got worse. A year ago, my wife and I were living in a modest but comfortable apartment. We weren't rich, but we were saving for a house and managing fine on our own. That's when her parents swooped in with what they called an amazing opportunity. They suggested we move into their house to save money faster. They claimed they wanted to help us get ahead, and my wife thought it was a generous offer. I wasn't so sure. Living with in-laws didn't sound like a good idea to me, but my wife was adamant that it would only be temporary and would help us reach our goals faster. I eventually agreed, thinking it couldn't be that bad. The first few weeks were manageable. They made a big show of being welcoming, always reminding us how lucky we were to have their support. But soon the cracks started to show. They began imposing rules, petty, controlling rules like insisting we eat dinner with them every night, even if I had to work late. My father-in-law constantly dropped comments about how I should be working longer hours to provide better, even though I already worked full-time and contributed equally with my wife. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, had no concept of boundaries. She'd do things like go through our laundry without asking, organize our belongings the way she thought was best, and even snoop through our mail. It was irritating, but I let it slide because I didn't want to cause tension. The money issues started not long after. One evening, my father-in-law sat me down for what he called a man-to-man talk. He suggested I let him manage our savings since, according to him, I was too inexperienced to handle real money. When I politely declined, he became offended and told me I was being reckless and didn't trust family. That conversation was just the beginning. About 2 months in, I noticed a large transfer, $5000, missing from our joint account. When I asked my wife about it, she hesitated before admitting her parents had convinced her to loan them the money for some vague business investment. They had promised to pay it back with interest. I was furious, not just with them, but with her for not consulting me first. I told her this was the last time we'd lend them money, and she agreed. But they didn't stop asking. Every few weeks, there'd be a new emergency or opportunity that required money. I stood firm and refused, which only made them more passive-aggressive and hostile. One day, I caught my mother-in-law snooping through a printed copy of our bank statements that I had accidentally left on the kitchen counter. She had the audacity to criticize my spending, pointing out things like eating out or a recent laptop purchase, saying I needed to be smarter with money if I wanted to buy a house. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about helping us. They wanted to control every aspect of our lives. The final straw came when my father-in-law started demanding we contribute to household expenses, including rent. The whole reason we moved in was to save money, and now they wanted us to pay for the privilege of living under their roof. I realized then that this arrangement wasn't temporary or generous. It was a trap. They wanted us dependent on them, financially and emotionally. I decided enough was enough. I started looking for a house in secret. I didn't tell my wife at first because I knew she'd feel torn between me and her parents, and I needed to be sure this was the right move before involving her. During my lunch breaks and weekends, I worked with a realtor, checking out houses and crunching numbers. Within 2 months, I found a modest but perfect 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. I used money from a separate account I'd started before we got married to secure the mortgage, ensuring her parents couldn't interfere. Once the deal was finalized, I told my wife. She was shocked and initially upset that I hadn't included her in the process. I explained why I had kept it a secret. Her parents were toxic, manipulative, and draining us financially. I showed her how much money we had lost since moving in with them and reminded her of our original goal, to buy a home and live independently. After a long discussion, she agreed it was time to move out. When we broke the news to her parents, they completely lost it. Her father accused me of being ungrateful and stealing his daughter away. Her mother cried, saying I was ruining the family. Her father even threatened to sue me for the money he claimed we owed him for living under their roof. I told him, very calmly, that he could try, but without any signed agreement, he didn't have a leg to stand on. The look on his face was priceless. We moved out a week later. I thought that was the end of it, but I severely underestimated just how far her parents were willing to go. Not long after we moved into our new house, I got a letter in the mail saying a lien had been placed on the property. I didn't understand what was going on until I read further and saw that my father-in-law had filed the lien, claiming I owed him $25,000 for loans he had allegedly given us while we lived under his roof. I was furious. This wasn't just about control anymore. He was actively trying to sabotage us. He thought he could scare me into paying him off, or maybe even force us to sell the house. I wasn't about to let that happen. I contacted a real estate attorney immediately, and we started gathering evidence to prove the claim was fraudulent. I had bank records, text messages, and receipts showing there was never any loan agreement or financial arrangement with him. When the case went to court, my father-in-law showed up acting like he was the victim. He told the judge that he had generously supported us and that I had promised to pay him back, but never followed through. The judge asked him for any documentation or proof of this agreement, and of course, he didn't have any. The case was dismissed, and the lien was removed from our property. But I didn't stop there. Filing a frivolous lien is a serious offense, so I filed a countersuit against him for damages and legal fees. He ended up having to pay not only my legal costs, but also a fine for wasting the court's time. The best part was that the rest of the family found out what he had done. I made sure to share the court documents with everyone so they could see for themselves. The fallout was spectacular. Relatives who used to defend him started distancing themselves, and his reputation in the family took a massive hit. After the lien fiasco, I thought they might back off, but I was wrong. A few weeks later, my mother-in-law called my wife in tears. She claimed my father-in-law had been hospitalized for a heart condition and that they needed $10,000 immediately to pay for his medical bills. My wife was distraught and wanted to help, but something about the timing felt off. Why hadn't they mentioned anything about his health before? Why were they asking us when they had other family members who could help? I told my wife to wait before sending any money and decided to look into it myself. I called the hospital where they claimed he was admitted, only to find out he wasn't there, or anywhere else. He wasn't even in the system. When I confronted my mother-in-law, she stumbled over her words, saying the bill had already been paid by someone else. I pressed her for details, and she finally admitted there had been no hospitalization. It was a ploy to get money out of us. I wasn't going to let them get away with this one either. I started reaching out to other family members, and it turned out my in-laws had been pulling the same scam on other relatives. They had managed to squeeze $3,000 out of a cousin just a few weeks earlier. I shared what I had discovered, including my call to the hospital, and warned everyone not to give them any money. Word spread quickly, and my in-laws found themselves cut off from the financial support they had been relying on for years. But their most outrageous move came a few months later. My wife and I were planning to start a family, and somehow, her parents found out. That's when they filed a petition for grandparent visitation rights in family court, claiming they were concerned I would cut them off from their future grandchildren. This was insane. We didn't even have kids yet, and they were already trying to use the legal system to force their way into our lives. I wasn't going to let them bully us like this. I hired a family lawyer and started building a case. We documented everything: the fake lien, the fraudulent medical emergency, their invasive and manipulative behavior while we lived with them. By the time we went to court, we had a mountain of evidence showing they were toxic and had no place in our future children's lives. The judge took one look at our evidence and dismissed their petition, even warning them against filing baseless claims in the future. To make sure they couldn't pull anything like this again, my lawyer sent them a cease and desist letter, making it clear that any further harassment would lead to legal consequences. At this point, they had burned every bridge they had. Most of the family was no longer speaking to them, and their attempts to meddle in our lives had only left them isolated. We've been living in peace ever since. My wife and I worked hard to rebuild trust after everything that happened, and we're stronger now than we've ever been. Her parents occasionally try to stir up drama, but we've set firm boundaries and refuse to let them back into our lives. Looking back, I'm proud of how I stood my ground and protected my family. Sometimes the only way to deal with manipulative people is to fight back harder than they expect.